Birds Britannia is a landmark series by the Natural History Unit, which blends together the social and cultural history of the British people with the ecological, the environmental, the species history, if you like, of British birds, and interweaves and interlinks that complex story and shows how the attitudes and values and perceptions that we've had have shaped the futures and destinies of so much of our bird life here in this country. And we are, of course, a nation obsessed by birds. The garden bird feeding industry is worth £200 million in this country. The RSPB has 1,070,000 members. That's more than all the political parties in Britain put together. We are a nation truly obsessed by our birds. And Birds Britannia tells that story, how over 200 years that has happened. Well, I've got bird notebooks that go back to when I was about 9 or 10 years old. It's an absolute fascination for wildlife and natural history. And now, of course, as a global bird watcher, I'm lucky to travel the world from Australia to New Zealand to Antarctica 3 times. With my students, because environmental history is such a new discipline, I try and link it back to some of the history that they are familiar with. So for instance, one story that they get particularly excited about is to do with the founding and creation of the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And I make the point that William Wilberforce, who they're all so familiar with for the anti-slavery campaign, was a founder member of the RSPCA in 1824. In other words, Wilberforce made that hugely important connection that if you could be cruel to an animal, you could then go on to be cruel to a fellow human being. And there's a real sense of revelation when I tell that story. I also tell the story about the establishment of the RSPB in 1889 and these marvellous middle-class ladies from Manchester, ornithological suffragettes, if you like, who were furious about the hat trade and the deaths of egrets and herons to satisfy ladies' fashion and the plumes that were in ladies' hats in the Victorian period. And so they got particularly riled and angered by this, and so formed an organisation, a Society for the Protection of Birds, to campaign and lobby for an end to the plumage trade. One of the marvellous things they did, though, was they'd go to church on a Sunday around the Manchester area and they'd take careful note of all the ladies sat in the pews who were wearing hats with plumes in them. And then these ladies would get rather aggressive letters in the early part of the following week, pointing out to them how many birds have suffered simply for the fashion. It's very much like the 1960s and 1970s sort of anti-fur campaigns that Wallonal supermodels by the 1980s had seized on this as well. My environmental historians have gone on to work for environmental NGOs like the RSPB, the National Trust. They've gone to work for policy organisations in government charities, government agencies and other organisations. Some of the business school students, of course, will go and work in industry. Many of them will perhaps work in CSR departments where they will be able to factor in environmental decisions. One of the great sea changes in the business world has been the fact that some of the largest corporations in Britain have now environmental officers on staff. Some of the big tourism organisations and airlines now have environmental officers on staff. And these, I think, are the 2 routes that most of my students are taking. I think the relationship that we have with the environment, with biodiversity, with the natural world, with the countless millions of species that we share this planet with is perhaps one of our most fundamental relationships. And as we plan for a sustainable future in the 21st century in the face of global warming and climate change and sea level rises and increasing pollution and growing population levels, then that becomes even more of a challenge and even more of an opportunity to forge a much better accommodation, if you like, with the natural world around us. And I think that it also taps into our very human need to engage and interact with nature. I filmed over the summer a 1.5-hour documentary called When Britain Went Wild, which was a look at the 1960s and 1970s, look at the conservationists and the filmmakers and the environmental issues that shaped those 2 decades. I've also been filming in Scotland for a new series called Making Scotland's Landscape, which is in effect an environmental history of Scotland. looking at the story of the seas, the mountains, the rivers, the forests, the lochs, and also how the people have shaped those landscapes as well as natural forces. I think there is a movement in academia linked to impact and to knowledge transfer and to getting out there and telling stories and being consultants and being advisors. And I think that this is a really important part of what we do. And I think to not take these opportunities, I think, is to sort of leave ourselves out in the cold, because there is, I think, a real thirst, particularly on channels like BBC4, for good, scholarly, accessible storytelling.